So this is a remarkable period of activism, of cultural production, and in a way it feels almost as though it's in tension with some of what we heard earlier. This is a time when so many women move into public life in many different ways. It's actually a period, the 1930s, when, contrary to expectations, the proportion of women earning wages actually increases. And yet, is this really a moment of liberation or a moment of independence for women? Does this actually result in a kind of new freedom?
It's a complicated question, and I think to try to create a short answer is difficult. But let me try to say the following. So here's a period in which, on the one hand, the economic opportunity for women to engage in cultural production, because there is federal support or financial support for them, to continue to work because their families actually need them to work. Those kinds of economic incentives to work are enormous in this period. And on the other hand, there's an ideology which promotes the family, which fears the disruption of the family, which recognizes that women are the linchpins to holding the family together, and that men can't be undermined in their roles as providers, because that too would undermine the family. So I think when we look at the 1930s, what we have to see is the tension between those two things. On the one hand, the push into the labor force by needy families. On the other hand, the pull back out of the labor force by an ideology that is terrified, as I don't think too strong a word, that women will lose their sense of themselves as family members. So when you ask, is it a period when women become more independent? I'd say no. I'd say that unlike the 20s, this is a period when women rationalize their efforts to move out into the labor force in terms of family need, not in terms of their own satisfaction or their own ambitious desires to make it in the workforce, or indeed even in terms of their own desire to support themselves. In general, for all kinds of women, and here I think is one of the moments when black and white women actually come together, though of course in different jobs and in different ways and at different levels, but come together in understanding that women's work is in the family, and if that work in the family takes one out into the wage labor force, it's only a way of supporting and strengthening family life.
And these ideas are then reflected in the social welfare state that begins to emerge and consolidate in this period.
Exactly right, that the social welfare state that begins to emerge affirms and confirms women's home roles, if you like. That is, it supports men's efforts to remain attached to the labor force, to support their families even when their incomes disappear, as when they get old or sick, for example. And at the same time, it supports women's efforts, and especially the efforts of single mothers, deserted mothers, widows, and so on, to stay at home with their children. And these policies, I think, have a very large impact on the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Indeed, you might say that these policies only in the 1970s, with the rise of a new women's movement, only then did they begin to unravel.
And so in this moment of great upheaval, what becomes of previous ideals of femininity? Is separate spheres still a concept with valence in this time?
Well, separate spheres begins to crumble, of course, because the line between wage work out of the home and work for the home becomes much more permeable than it was. If women are working for ambition, you can see them sort of riding over the barrier of separate spheres. But if you see women actually earning wages for the family, or rationalizing their work outside as work for the family, if you see the state supporting women's work outside the family when it is for the family, and paying, in some sense, to have women stay at home as mothers, then of course the separate spheres notion has already, it's begun to crumble. What's intriguing about this, of course, is that many people cling to that notion, or at least to the notion of domesticity for women and providerhood for men, if you like, as artifacts of how people should live. And we'll see when we get to the 1950s that that gets them and us into trouble. When the state starts paying for men to work outside, or to hold on to their work outside the family through WPA projects and so on, in order to support their families, and when the state starts paying for women who work inside the family, taking care of children to stay at home, then of course the line between men's work and women's work, between domesticity and providerhood, those lines have begun to blur.